I almost didn't go to the bank that morning. 8 months after my wife passed away, I still hadn't cleared out her safety deposit box. Every time I even thought about driving over to First National on Elm Street, something in my chest would tighten, and I'd come up with some excuse to stay home, watering the garden, fixing a loose fence post, anything to avoid sitting in that small, quiet room where Margaret used to say she kept her important papers and her peace of mind. But my attorney, Michael, had been gently reminding me for the past 2 months, and that Tuesday morning in March, he wasn't gentle anymore. He called at 7:30 a.m. and told me the estate couldn't be finalized until I emptied the box. So I put on my coat, drove the 11 miles into Clarksville, Tennessee, and walked through those glass doors like a man stepping straight into a cold wind. Emily Carter had been the branch manager there for nearly 15 years. Margaret and I knew her the way you know someone in a small town, well enough to wave from across a parking lot, close enough to ask about her kids by name. When she saw me walk in, she didn't smile the way people do when it's been a while. She smiled the way people do when they've been concerned. She came out from behind the counter before I even reached the service desk. "Harold," she said softly, "I'm glad you came in. I was planning to call you this week." She glanced over her shoulder toward the other tellers, then back at me. "Can we step into my office for a minute before we go down to the vault?" I followed her without saying a word. She shut the door and sat across from me, hands folded on the desk, the way someone sits when they're about to say something they've practiced. "Harold, 9 days ago, someone came in and tried to access Margaret's safety deposit box." I stared at her. They had an ID and a document claiming next of kin authorization. Our policy requires the executor to present the original death certificate and probate documents. This person had copies, not originals, and the notarization didn't look right to one of my tellers. She paused. We denied access and asked them to leave. I asked her who it was. She turned her monitor toward me. The security footage was grainy, like bank cameras always are, but I didn't need a clear image to recognize the man in the gray jacket standing at the vault window, the shape of his shoulders, the way he shifted his weight onto his left foot when he was nervous. I had known that posture for 34 years. It was my son, Ethan. I sat in Emily's office for a long time after that, long enough for her to bring me a cup of coffee without asking. I held it in my hands without taking a sip. My son had tried to get into his mother's safety deposit box 9 days before I finally found the strength to come here myself, 9 days after Michael told me it was time to close the estate. Either Ethan had been watching and waiting, or someone had tipped him off that I was finally taking action. Neither possibility sat well with me. We went down to the vault. Emily gave me privacy and pulled the door nearly shut behind her. The box was a simple gray metal rectangle, and when I lifted the lid, I found exactly what Margaret had always kept inside. The deed to our house, both of our birth certificates, her grandmother's, ring tucked into a velvet pouch, ordinary things, expected things. Beneath all of that was a sealed white envelope with my name written on it in her handwriting. Not Harold, not Dad, not even the nickname she'd used since our second date. She had written my full name, Harold James Whitfield, the way you address something you need someone to take seriously. I sat down in the small chair and opened it. Margaret had written 4 pages, front and back, in the careful cursive she'd learned from the nuns at St. Catherine's back in 1971 and never forgot. The date at the top was 11 weeks before the accident that took her life. She wrote that she loved me and that she was sorry she hadn't come to me sooner. She said she'd been trying to confirm what she suspected before saying anything because she knew how I felt about Charles Harrington and didn't want me making decisions out of anger without proof. She admitted she was afraid, not for herself, but for what the truth might do to our family. Then she told me what she had discovered. Margaret had handled the books for Whitfield and Harrington Construction for 6 years after I brought Charles on as a partner in 2009. We built commercial properties across Middle Tennessee, warehouses, small retail centers, even an assisted living facility outside Nashville that I was especially proud of. Charles handled the clients and had a natural sales instinct, while I managed operations and held the licenses. For the first 7 years, everything worked the way a solid partnership should. Margaret stopped doing the books in 2016 when her mother got sick and she needed to focus on her. I brought in an accounting firm and trusted Charles. I trusted the reports they gave me each quarter. What Margaret found 3 years after stepping away was a second set of books. She hadn't gone looking for anything. She had gone into my home office to grab a stapler and opened the wrong drawer. Inside was a folder that didn't belong to me, even though it carried our company letterhead, and the numbers in it didn't match the reports I had been receiving. She didn't understand everything at first, so she quietly started taking photos of the pages with her phone over the following weeks, slipping back into that drawer whenever I wasn't home, building a record before confronting anyone. What those documents showed, as far as she could piece together, was that Charles had been running a parallel billing system on at least 4 major projects over the past 6 years. Inflated subcontractor invoices, payments to companies that only existed on paper. The difference between what clients were billed and what was actually spent had been going somewhere else, somewhere outside our company accounts. And the name that showed up on 2 of the internal routing memos wasn't Charles's. It was Ethan's. My son had been working at Whitfield in Harrington for 4 years by then, handling project logistics. I had given him that position because I believed in giving family real responsibility, in building something worth passing down. I told myself I was preparing him for the future. What I hadn't been paying attention to was what he was doing with the access that future required. The letter ended with Margaret explaining that she had copied all the photos onto a USB drive, which she placed inside a small red case in the safety deposit box, and that she had been planning to contact our attorney, Michael, along with a forensic accountant she had researched before speaking to me. She wanted everything secured. She wanted to protect me from reacting too soon before we knew the full truth. 11 weeks later, she was gone. A wet road, a guardrail, a curve she had driven 100 times. I sat in that vault room for a long time, then found the small red case tucked beneath her grandmother's ring, slipped it into my coat pocket, and walked out into the cool March afternoon. I'll be honest about those first few days. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I would sit at the kitchen table in the early hours of the morning with Margaret's letter in front of me, moving through grief and anger in a cycle I couldn't control. I missed her in a way that felt physical, like a constant pressure behind my chest that hadn't eased since October. And now that loss was tangled with something sharper. She had carried this burden alone. She had been quietly documenting evidence for weeks while still cooking dinner, tending the garden, and sitting beside me on the porch each evening. She had been protecting me, and then she was gone, and that protection disappeared with her. On the 4th day, I called Michael. I drove to his office, sat across from him, and placed the USB drive and the letter on his desk without saying a word. He read the letter twice, then plugged in the drive and went through the photos for nearly 20 minutes in silence. When he finally looked up, there was no shock in his face, only the steady, controlled expression of someone who had seen things like this before and understood that the person sitting across from him was barely holding steady. He told me we needed to proceed carefully. He said he wanted to bring in a forensic accountant named Laura Bennett, based in Nashville, someone who had testified in multiple federal fraud cases. He warned me not to confront Charles, not to confront Ethan, and not to show any sign that anything had changed. I asked him about the accident. Michael went quiet for a moment, then said that was not something he could answer, that it was a question for a different kind of professional. But he didn't dismiss it. He let it sit there between us, the way serious men acknowledge serious possibilities without rushing to conclusions. I drove home, fed the dog, then sat on the porch, watching the fields fade into darkness. Laura Bennett was a small woman in her early 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke about financial fraud the way a surgeon talks about anatomy, precise, detached, completely focused on what she was examining. She came to Michael's office on a Thursday morning and spent 4 hours reviewing the contents of the USB drive with a laptop and a yellow legal pad. When she finished, she asked me 3 questions and gave me 2 key findings. First, based on the documents Margaret had captured, the scheme had been running for about 6 years and involved inflated billing and payments to ghost vendors across at least 7 projects. Her early estimate of the money diverted ranged between $800,000 and $1.2 million. Second, the internal routing memos with Ethan's name showed that he had approved payment releases to 2 of those ghost vendors. Whether he fully understood what was happening or had been partially misled wasn't something she could determine from the documents alone, but his name was clearly there. twice. I drove home and thought about my son. Ethan was 31 years old. His mother had named him after her father. He had played baseball through high school, taken a gap year that turned into 2 before eventually coming to work with us. He had always been the child who needed a little more time than his sister Claire before finding his footing. I had given him that time. I had given him the job, my patience, and every opportunity I could. And then I thought about Charles. Charles Harrington had been at my wedding. He had sat at my table during Margaret's funeral, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said the things people say in moments like that. He had looked me straight in the eye while saying them. And somewhere before that, he had built a system designed to quietly drain the company I had spent 30 years building, and had drawn my son into it, making it that much harder to unravel. I called Michael and told him to move forward with everything. Laura needed access to the actual company financial systems to complete her analysis, which meant Michael had to carefully handle the legal side without raising suspicion. He filed for a routine audit review as part of the estate process. My ownership share in the company was tied to the estate, which gave us a legitimate opening. Charles didn't object. He had no reason to think the audit was anything more than routine paperwork. Laura spent 3 weeks going through the company records. The final figure she came back with was $1.1 million over 6 years, spread across 9 projects and 11 shell companies, most of them already dissolved, with one still technically active under the name of one of Charles's relatives, who likely had no idea their identity had been used. The structure was complex enough to pass through 3 years of quarterly reviews by our accounting firm, which Laura believed had been negligent, though probably not involved. Ethan's documented role included approving 8 specific payment releases over a 2-year period. Whether he had understood everything from the beginning or had been gradually pulled in, Michael said, would matter later, but not right now. Michael filed the case with the FBI field office in Nashville on a Wednesday morning. He had already been in contact with an agent there, a woman named Special Agent Ramirez, who had reviewed Laura's summary and expressed interest. The week after the filing, I drove to Ethan's apartment. I want to explain why I did that, before the arrests, before everything was settled, because I've thought about it many times since. The truth is, I needed to see my son before everything came crashing down on him. I needed to look at his face, not to give him a chance to run. I had already told Michael, and what had been set in motion was no longer something I could stop. But I needed one moment that belonged only to us, before lawyers, federal agents, and courtrooms turned every conversation into something transactional. He opened the door wearing a t-shirt and jeans, and I could tell right away that he sensed something was wrong. He had his mother's instincts. Always had. He could read a room before even stepping into it. I asked if I could come in. We sat at his kitchen table, and for a long time I didn't say anything. He waited. That was new. The Ethan I had raised would have filled the silence with words. This version of him didn't. He just waited. I told him I had gone to the bank. I told him about the letter. I told him about Laura and Michael. I made it clear I wasn't there to threaten him, bargain with him, or offer him a way out. I just needed to know one thing. Had he known, from the beginning, what Charles was actually doing? He stared down at the table for a long time, then finally looked up at me and said no. He explained that Charles had told him the payments were part of a subcontractor arrangement operating outside the normal billing system for legal reasons, something he described as tax structuring. He admitted he knew it was unusual, but Charles was the senior partner, and he trusted him. He said about 6 months in, he started to realize it wasn't what Charles had claimed, and by then, Charles had made it very clear what it would mean for him if he tried to walk away. He said he had been trying to figure out a way out for 2 years. He also said he had no idea about his mother's investigation. I believed him, not because I needed to, and not because it made anything easier, but because he had always been a terrible liar since he was 7, and because the look on his face when I said his mother's name was the same one I had seen in the mirror every morning since October. I told him what was coming. I told him he needed a very good attorney. Then I told him I loved him, and I went home. The FBI moved in on a Friday morning 6 weeks later. Charles was arrested at his office on federal fraud charges, while a forensic team began collecting the company's financial records. By the time I heard from Michael, It was already over. I won't pretend it felt the way revenge stories are supposed to feel. There was no moment of standing over someone with the upper hand, no dramatic confrontation where everything gets wrapped up with a final line. What I mostly felt was tired in a way that sleep can't fix, and beneath that, something that might have been relief. A separate investigation into Margaret's accident was opened through another office after Michael made a formal request. I can't say I ever got a clear answer. What I can say is that the accident reconstruction expert who reviewed the original report found irregularities he believed were worth looking into, and as of the last time I spoke with Michael, the case was still open. Whether it ever leads to a definitive conclusion, I don't know. I've had to come to terms with that uncertainty. What I do know is that my wife spent the final weeks of her life trying to protect what we had built together. She was careful, brave, and methodical, and she did it quietly, without panic, the same way she handled every difficult thing in her life. She secured the evidence, left it somewhere safe, and wrote me a letter, signing it the same way she signed every Christmas card and every birthday note she ever slipped into my coat pocket. All my love, always, Margaret. The company was restructured through legal proceedings. Charles's assets were placed under recovery orders, and while I knew we would never recover the full $1.1 million, enough was returned to make a difference. My attorneys dissolved the partnership, and since I held the licenses, what remained of Whitfield and Harrington became mine to decide the future of. I brought in a project manager I trusted and scaled things back to a level I could oversee personally. Smaller projects, clients I knew well, the kind of work I used to do before Charles came along, and everything grew too large and complicated. Ethan fully cooperated with the investigation. His attorney negotiated an outcome that included a significant fine and a period of supervised probation. He did not serve prison time, and I know people who hear this story will have their opinions about that. I've made my own peace with it. He's working in a different field now, far removed from construction, and we talk on the phone twice a week. It's slow, the way rebuilding trust always is, but it's real. Claire, my daughter, came down from Cincinnati when everything surfaced and stayed for 3 weeks. She took care of the rest of Margaret's belongings, something I hadn't been able to bring myself to do. She cooked meals, sat with me in the evenings, and didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed. She has always known when to speak and when to simply be there, a gift she inherited from her mother, and one I've been grateful for more times than I can count. There's one more thing I want to say, the thought I've returned to most in the months since all of this happened. I'm 68 years old. When Charles brought Ethan into that scheme, I believe part of his calculation was that I was the older partner, the one slowing down, the one who might not look too closely at things he trusted others to handle, the one who handed off the paperwork to an accounting firm and stopped asking questions because everything seemed fine, the one whose wife had stepped away from the books and whose son was now involved daily, the one who maybe didn't see as sharply as he once had. That calculation was wrong, but I have to admit why it was almost right. I had grown comfortable. I had let trust replace attention. I had done what many men my age do, built something, stabilized it, and then eased off, because easing off felt like rest. What Margaret understood, what she was trying to give me before she ran out of time, was that the cost of comfort can sometimes be everything you've worked to build. I think about her in my office, standing at my desk, quietly photographing those documents with her phone, focused, calm, determined, not driven by anger, just doing what needed to be done because she loved me, and she loved what we had created together, and she wasn't going to let it be taken without a fight. That's who she was for 40 years. I just didn't always see it clearly until I had no choice. The safety deposit box is closed now. I kept the letter. It's in my desk drawer, not locked. I've read it more times than I can count, and every time I reach the end and see her handwriting signing off with those words, I feel the full weight of losing her, and the full weight of what she left me at the same time. I've started paying closer attention to everything, the books, the contracts, the people I work with, and the reasons I trust them. I ask questions I used to assume I already knew the answers to. I don't let comfort turn into complacency anymore. It's not a lesson I would have chosen, but it's the one I was given, and it's one I intend to keep.